Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to ask, are you a hobby hipster or an old grognard? So this week I'm tackling another subscriber question. Victor Suarez asked, following trends or sticking with your tried and trusted methods? Do people follow the trends, keep to what they know, or like me, do both, he says. Well, I've deliberately focused this question on the modelling and painting side of our hobby because so much has changed in the 40 odd years that I've been producing miniatures for the tabletop. When I first started painting miniatures, way back in the early 80s, white metal alloys were only just starting to replace lead pewter in a big way, and nearly all miniatures were still cast in metal. It was still common to see figures sometimes painted in enamels, and it was standard to varnish everything to a painfully high gloss. Inks and washes were rarely seen in wargaming figures, certainly in the wargaming figure painting arena, and 3D printing was still science fiction. Adoption of some new innovations has been inevitable, but does that make me, and you, a bunch of hobby hipsters? So clearly there's been a lot of water under the bridge. As I say, I've been painting miniatures for over 40 years now, and clearly I have adopted new techniques and products since I first wielded a brush in the early 80s. That doesn't mean I'm slavishly following the latest fad trend. I have my tried and trusted methods, but I do like to experiment and try new things, and my technique, if you can call it that, has evolved over time, and I expect it will continue to do so. However, while I try to paint to what I consider to be a reasonable tabletop standards, I'm not primarily a painter, I'm a gamer. So while I'm not averse to trying new techniques, I'm not doing it solely to get better results. I'm not aiming to win any competitions with my miniatures, although of course I want my little metal men to look very smart as they go into battle. I'm more motivated by what makes me a more productive painter, by speeding up the process. I'm also happy to adopt new products if they represent an improvement to something that I've used before. So while I have adopted some new methods, fad trends in technique are, I believe, largely there for the pro gamers, in my humble opinion. Now, having confirmed that I'm not a complete laggard, maybe this is a good point to look at those trends that I've either not tried or rejected, and why, and then I'll discuss those developments that I have adopted. So what developments from the last 40 years have I not adopted? Well, plastic miniatures, I'm afraid, are still not my first choice when selecting miniatures to paint. Don't get me wrong, I've bought them, I've used them for Frostgrave amongst other things, but I still prefer to paint metal minis. Likewise, I'm not a huge fan of some of the resin miniatures that are available, and will buy metal first if I have the choice. I accept that I'm a bit old-fashioned in this respect, but while I will still buy metal. That's what I'll use. It's not just the weight of the mini in the hand that I like. I just enjoy painting metal miniatures more than any other material. I know it's an irrational and to a certain degree nostalgic decision, but not one I regret, to be honest. Another development that seems to have come into the wargaming painters sphere that never used to be is airbrushes. I don't own an airbrush, and I probably never will. This is partly down to a lack of space. As you can tell, there's not a lot of room in here to swing a cat, let alone have a airbrush. And it's nothing to do with lack of fun, it's just lack of space. Something that may change over time. I'm not sure that I'll probably will give it a go at some point in the future, but I'll need more workspace and the time to master the equipment. So maybe this is a project for my retirement, you never know. For the time being, I don't see any value in it, as I paint mostly small scale stuff. And an airbrush is pretty useless when you're faced with a 6mm figure. So why airbrush when primer can do the same thing? I can almost hear the sharp intake of breath from the airbrush owners watching this, but that's the way I think. Another development, I don't own a 3D printer, and I'm not sure that I want to be honest. I've bought 3D printed models, I'm quite able to buy them and paint them up. I've been very impressed by printed miniatures, but personally I'd rather leave this skill to somebody else. Price is a factor, as is space again. I have nowhere to set up a printer except on my games table. And even if at some unspecified time in the future I get a bigger games room, I really can't see myself buying into this. It's a whole different skill set, and I'm just not sure I can be bothered to master it. And then on the technique side, there's zenithal highlighting. Now, I'm not sure when this technique started, but I became aware of it in the mid 2010s, and it's a popular one that some sectors of the hobby swear by. I've experimented with the method using spray primers rather than airbrush, as we often see in some videos, and in the end it didn't really become part of my regular routine because most of my collection is 15mm or smaller, and it's really a technique that I think works best on 25mm or larger figures. And in addition, as previously mentioned, I don't use an airbrush where the paint is generally thinner, allowing the highlight that you've put underneath to show through to the top coat, producing smoother shading. All a bit pointless when you're painting 6mm figures, to be honest, and if I ever start working in more 28mm, I may change my mind, especially if I use it in conjunction with contrast paints. But for the time being, zenithal highlighting isn't for me. But what have I adopted? Well, having made myself sound like a terribly old grognard, I have to admit that I have adopted some changes since I first started painting. I think it would be fair to say that when it comes to certain techniques and products, I'm a little bit more flexible than perhaps I am over equipment. As I mentioned earlier, I'm always trying to improve my technique, but I'm more influenced by new ways of doing things that improve overall productivity rather than quality, although if I can achieve both, even better. Very early on in my painting career, if you can call it that, I switched to Vallejo acrylics, and they've remained my favourite brand of paint through the years. I used to use Games Workshop stuff. I didn't like it when they changed brands. I had a try at Vallejo acrylics and have loved them ever since. And I'm not likely to change in the future either, because I've come to I know how they paint. I know how much I can dilute them, for instance, how medium thinner affects them, what the drying times are like. I know the properties of that particular paint, so I'm not likely to change paints, to be honest. And you know, the same could be said for any of you out there who've got your own favourite brand. Once you've got a favourite brand, you're very unlikely to change, I imagine. Now, I regularly use inks and washes, even on 6mm figures. Now, I first started using these when I moved from painting individual figures for role-playing to multiple figures and units for wargames. Started using washes and inks to achieve quick shading long before the brand Quickshade hit the market in 2007. I now use a variety of inks, washes and quick shades routinely across all the scales I paint, including 6mm. And I doubt if this is very controversial, as I expect most wargame painters will have incorporated these products in their own painting styles long ago. Or maybe they've always been using them. Now, I have recently experimented with contrast paints, and while they aren't really designed for small scale figures, I've still found some uses for them. I recently used contrast on some of my 15mm French colonial figures, for instance. And now I have a small collection of Games Workshop contrast paints, and I want to get the newer Army Painter speed paints. So this is a new development that I probably will make more use of, albeit maybe not the way the manufacturers designed them. So as always, I want to throw this question out to you and ask, are you a hobby hipster or an old grognard when it comes to modelling and painting? Have you adopted every new hobby trend that has appeared, or are you like me, a little bit more selective? Do you have your tried and trusted methods that will likely remain unchanged for the rest of your hobby career? Or are you more flexible and happy to experiment and change and adopt where necessary? And lastly, have you adopted a new trend like using airbrushes or 3D printing, only to regret it later? We hear lots of people saying how great they are, but we don't often hear people saying, that wasn't for me. As always, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below and hear your experiences. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video today, and if you did, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.